Sometimes the heart knows truths that the mind refuses to accept. Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where the February cold can steal your breath and your life in the same cruel moment, Dr. Elena Vasquez never expected to find herself chasing wolves through knee-deep snow. As a child psychologist, she'd come to the remote village of Koyuk to investigate strange reports, children claiming they could speak to the local wolf pack, parents worried their kids were losing touch with reality. But when Elena saw that massive grey wolf gently take little Nayeli by the coat sleeve and lead her into the forest, something deeper than professional curiosity took over, something that had been sleeping since she'd lost her own daughter 3 years ago. Now, stumbling through a blizzard that should have been impossible to navigate, Elena follows tracks that seem to glow in the moonlight, leading her towards sounds she can't quite believe. The laughter of children echoing from somewhere ahead, mixed with the haunting calls of wolves that sound almost human. Elena's frostbitten fingers clutch her radio, but she knows no one would believe what she's seeing. The question isn't whether she'll survive this frozen wilderness, it's whether she'll survive learning the truth about what really happened to all those missing children. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The radio crackled once more against Elena's frozen fingers before falling silent. Dead battery, or maybe the cold had finally killed it. Either way, she was truly alone now in this white hell, following phantom tracks that defied everything she knew about physics and sanity. 6 hours earlier, she'd been sitting in the overheated community center of Koyuk, nursing bitter coffee and listening to Uki Panyak, the village elder, describe the impossible. Children disappearing for hours, only to return speaking of conversations with wolves, kids drawing pictures of animals with human eyes. Nightmares that weren't quite nightmares but felt more like memories of places they'd never been. "Dr. Vasquez," Uki had said, his weathered hands wrapped around his own steaming mug, "you think we're dealing with trauma, yes? Some kind of collective response to isolation, maybe the stories our grandparents told us?" Elena had nodded then, her clinical training automatically cataloguing possibilities. Shared psychosis, cultural suggestion, the normal stress responses of children living in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. She dealt with similar cases in Anchorage. Urban kids who claimed they could hear their dead pets, rural children who insisted trees whispered secrets. Always, there'd been rational explanations. "We've had child services up here before," Uki continued. "They take notes, write reports, recommend therapy. But this is different. These children aren't distressed, they're peaceful, more peaceful than they've ever been." The first red flag should have been how quickly the village parents agreed to let her observe their children. In her experience, indigenous communities were rightfully wary of outside psychologists. Too many generations of forced assimilation, of being told their cultural practices were symptoms of mental illness. But here, even the most protective mothers had practically begged her to watch their kids. The second red flag came when she'd met Nayeli that afternoon. 6 years old, dark eyes bright with intelligence, speaking perfect English despite her grandmother insisting she'd been refusing to use anything but Inuktitut for months. The girl had looked at Elena with an expression far too knowing for her age. "You lost someone," Nayeli had said matter-of-factly. Not a question, but a statement. "She's waiting for you." Elena's breath had caught. She hadn't mentioned Sophia to anyone here. Her daughter's death 3 years ago in that car accident wasn't something she discussed with patients or colleagues, let alone a child she'd just met. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" Elena had managed to ask. "The wolves told me. They know about waiting." Now, stumbling through snow that reached her thighs, Elena couldn't shake the memory of those words. Her training screamed that she was experiencing a psychological break, that grief and isolation and the extreme cold were creating hallucinations. The tracks she followed couldn't really be glowing with their own inner light. The wind couldn't actually be carrying the sound of children's voices singing lullabies in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Yet here she was, her expensive winter gear already failing against the brutal temperature, chasing after a little girl who'd walked into the forest with a wolf, like she was going to school with her older brother. Elena's phone had died 2 miles back. Her GPS had started spinning wildly before the screen went black. The blizzard that had risen seemingly from nowhere made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But somehow those tracks remained visible. 4 padded wolf prints alongside small boot marks, both pressed deep into snow that should have been blown away by the howling wind. She'd tried to turn back twice. The rational part of her mind, the part that had earned advanced degrees and published papers on childhood psychology, kept insisting this was suicide. She had no survival training, no experience with Alaskan wilderness. She'd grown up in San Diego, for God's sake. Her idea of roughing it was a hotel without room service. But each time she'd attempted to retrace her steps, the tracks behind her had vanished, while the trail ahead remained clear as a neon sign. And those voices in the wind, children laughing, playing, calling out in the same mixture of languages she'd heard in Koyuk, seemed to grow stronger whenever she hesitated. Sophia. The name escaped her lips before she could stop it, a desperate whisper that the wind caught and carried away. For just a moment, she could swear she heard a familiar giggle in response, the sound her daughter used to make when they played hide-and-seek. Elena's legs burned with exhaustion. Her lungs ached from breathing air so cold it felt like swallowing glass, but she pressed forward. Because somewhere ahead, a little girl who reminded her too much of the daughter she'd failed to protect was walking deeper into wilderness that could kill them both. And because, despite everything her education told her was possible, those glowing tracks were leading somewhere specific. Somewhere the voices were getting clearer, more distinct. Somewhere children who should have been frozen solid were singing. The singing stopped. Elena froze mid-step, one boot suspended above a glowing paw print that pulsed like a heartbeat in the snow. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the impossible voices had been. Without their guidance, she became acutely aware of how completely lost she was, a middle-aged psychologist from California who couldn't even keep her houseplants alive, now standing alone in an Alaskan wilderness that killed experienced hunters. What am I doing? The question crashed through her mind with the force of the wind that whipped her hair across her frozen cheeks. This wasn't her life. Her life was scheduled appointments and clinical assessments, insurance forms and peer reviews. Her life was the carefully controlled environment of her Anchorage practice, where the biggest danger was running out of tissues during particularly emotional sessions. Her life was also the reason she was here. 3 years ago, Dr. Elena Vasquez had been a different person entirely. She'd had routines then, real ones, not the hollow rituals that now filled her days. Morning coffee shared with Sophia, who always insisted on extra marshmallows and would inevitably get them stuck to her nose. School drop-offs where her daughter would wave enthusiastically from the kindergarten door, backpack nearly as big as she was. Evening homework sessions that dissolved into giggles when Sophia would try to teach Elena the playground songs she'd learned. "Mommy, you're singing it wrong," Sophia would say, her gap-toothed grin infectious. "It goes like this." And she'd demonstrate with the unself-conscious joy that only 5-year-olds possessed, voice rising and falling with melodies that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and pure. Elena had been a good mother then. Not perfect. She'd worked too much, worried too much, sometimes lost her patience when Sophia dawdled during their morning routine. But she'd been present, engaged. She'd known every teacher's name, every classmate's birthday, every stuffed animal in Sophia's elaborate bedtime ritual. Her daughter had been the center of her universe, the reason she'd specialized in child psychology in the first place. After the accident, she'd tried to maintain some version of that life. Her colleagues at the hospital had been understanding, giving her time off, reducing her caseload. Her sister Carmen had flown up from Phoenix, staying for weeks to help Elena navigate the practical aspects of grief, funeral arrangements, insurance claims, the terrible task of packing away a child's room. Everyone expected her to break down, to require the same therapeutic intervention she provided to others. Instead, Elena had gone numb. She'd returned to work too soon, thrown herself into other people's children with a desperate intensity that worried everyone around her. She'd taken on the most difficult cases, abused kids, traumatized teenagers, families shattered by violence or neglect. She'd worked 16-hour days, published papers at a manic pace, spoken at conferences about childhood resilience, while ignoring her own complete lack of it. Her answering machine at home held 47 unheard messages from Carmen, each one increasingly concerned. The refrigerator contained only coffee, wine, and takeout containers she ordered but rarely ate. Her social calendar had been reduced to professional obligations and the twice-monthly visits to Sophia's grave that left her hollow and exhausted. She'd been existing, not living. Going through the motions of a life that felt like wearing someone else's clothes, technically, functional but never quite fitting right. Which was why, when the call came from Koyuk requesting a specialist to investigate reports of children communicating with wolves, Elena had volunteered immediately. Her supervisor had tried to dissuade her, suggesting she wasn't ready for such an isolated assignment. The village was accessible only by bush plane or snow machine, would require camping in sub-zero temperatures, dealing with a culture whose approach to child-rearing might challenge her Western training. "I need this," Elena had insisted, though she couldn't articulate why. Maybe it was the promise of distance from her empty Anchorage apartment. Maybe it was the appeal of a mystery that might finally engage her professionally dormant curiosity. Or maybe, though she'd never admit this aloud, it was the desperate hope that somewhere in this impossible situation she might find something that made sense of Sophia's death. Now, standing in snow that reached her hips, while phantom children sang lullabies in the darkness, Elena realized how naive that hope had been. Nothing would ever make sense of losing a child. Nothing would ever fill the Sophia-shaped hole in her chest. She'd been chasing ghosts across a frozen wasteland because facing the truth was harder than risking death. A new sound cut through the wind, not children's voices this time, but something deeper, a low, melodic howling that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The tracks at her feet pulsed brighter, as if responding to the call. Elena's radio crackled once against her chest, a burst of static that almost sounded like words. Almost sounded like her name, spoken in a voice she'd been trying to forget for 3 years. She looked ahead into the swirling snow, where the glowing trail continued toward whatever impossible truth awaited, and took another step forward. The howling grew closer, transforming from distant melody to something Elena could feel in her bones. She stumbled forward, her numb feet struggling to follow the glowing tracks that now pulsed in rhythm with her racing heart. The sound wasn't coming from one wolf. She could distinguish at least 4 distinct voices, maybe more, weaving together in harmonies that no wild animal should possess. Then she saw them. Through the swirling snow, golden eyes materialized like stars against the darkness. Not the predatory gleam she expected, but something achingly familiar. The same patient, knowing expression she'd seen in therapy dogs visiting traumatized children. The same look Sophia's old golden retriever had given her during those first terrible nights after the funeral, when grief made sleep impossible. The largest wolf stepped forward, and Elena's breath caught. It was massive, easily twice the size of any wolf she'd seen in documentaries, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the storm's fury. But what stopped her heart wasn't its size. It was the small figure walking beside it, hand resting casually on the creature's back as if they were old friends heading home from the park. Nayeli. The 6-year-old looked completely unharmed, her bright winter coat unmarked by the journey that had nearly killed Elena. She walked with the confident stride of a child who knew exactly where she was going, chattering to the wolf in that mixture of English and Inuktitut Elena had heard earlier. But as they drew closer, Elena realized with growing shock that the conversation wasn't one-sided. The wolf was responding. Not with barks or growls, but with something that sounded impossibly like words, low, rumbling syllables that carried meaning Elena couldn't quite grasp, but somehow understood. The creature's mouth didn't move the way a human's would, yet the sounds emerged clear and deliberate, as if language itself had found a new form. "You came," Nayeli said, her dark eyes meeting Elena's across the snow. She spoke as if Elena's arrival had been expected, planned for. "She said you would, even though you didn't want to." "Who said?" Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw from breathing the frozen air. Nayeli, sweetheart, we need to get you back to the village. It's dangerous out here. The little girl tilted her head with that too knowing expression Elena remembered from their first meeting. It's not dangerous if you belong here. And you do, don't you? That's why you followed. The wolf pack had formed a loose circle around them now, 7 massive creatures that should have been terrifying, but instead radiated an inexplicable sense of protection. Their eyes held intelligence that made Elena's scientific mind recoil, consciousness that defied everything she understood about animal cognition. When they looked at her, she felt seen in a way that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Elena. The voice came from the largest wolf, the one standing beside Nayeli. It spoke her name with perfect clarity, in tones that carried the weight of recognition. Not just knowing who she was, but knowing who she was. Her grief, her guilt, her desperate need to save someone after failing to save her daughter. Elena's legs gave out. She crashed to her knees in the snow, her expensive winter gear no protection against the cold that suddenly seemed to come from inside her bones. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Wolves didn't speak human names, didn't lead children on walks through blizzards, didn't sing harmonies that sounded like lullabies. "I'm having a breakdown," she whispered, the words carried away by wind that now felt gentle rather than brutal. "This is trauma psychosis. Grief-induced hallucination. I need to look at me." Nayeli's small hand touched Elena's cheek, fingers warm despite the sub-zero temperature. "Really look." Elena raised her eyes and felt the world shift. Because looking into Nayeli's face was like looking into a mirror of every lost child she'd ever failed to help, every patient who'd slipped through the system, every family she couldn't fix, every case that had ended in tears and court orders and children placed in homes that might be safer but would never feel like love. And underneath all of that, she saw Sophia. Not literally. Nayeli's features were her own, distinctly Inuit, beautiful in their uniqueness. But something in her expression, something in the way she held her head when she was thinking, something in the absolute trust with which she'd walked into the wilderness, echoed Elena's daughter so strongly that grief rose in her throat like a physical thing. "She's been waiting for you," Nayeli said softly. "They all have. But first, you have to choose." "Choose what?" Elena's voice broke on the words. The largest wolf stepped forward, its golden eyes holding depths that seemed to contain decades of patience. When it spoke again, its voice carried the weight of an ultimatum. "Whether you trust love or fear," it said. "Whether you follow us to the place where lost things are kept safe, or turn back to the world where nothing you've lost can ever be found." Elena stared into the swirling snow ahead, where the glowing tracks led toward something that would change everything forever. Elena's breath crystallized in the air between her and the wolf's impossible words. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind's howl and her own thundering heartbeat. Every rational cell in her body screamed at her to run, to dismiss this as hypothermia-induced madness, to cling to the scientific worldview that had been her anchor since childhood. But her feet wouldn't move. "I can't," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "I can't do this again." The wolf's golden eyes never wavered. "Again? Hope." The word came out broken, sharp-edged with 3 years of carefully suppressed pain. "I can't hope again. I can't believe in something impossible and beautiful just to have it ripped away." Elena's hands shook as she pressed them against her temples, trying to organize thoughts that felt like scattered leaves in a hurricane. "You want me to follow you to some magical place where lost things are kept safe, where Sophia might be waiting?" Her voice cracked on her daughter's name. "I tried that. I tried everything. I prayed to gods I didn't believe in. I researched near-death experiences. I went to mediums who promised they could connect me with her. I spent a year chasing ghosts because I couldn't accept that dead meant gone." Nayeli's small hand found Elena's wrist, her touch impossibly warm through Elena's frozen gloves. "What if this time is different?" "It's never different." Elena pulled away, stumbling backward through the snow. "It's always the same cruel joke. Something offers you exactly what you need most, makes you believe for just long enough to remember what happiness felt like, and then reality comes crashing back down. The memories flooded through her. Sophia's empty car seat in the wreckage, the doctor's gentle but final pronouncement, the funeral director's careful questions about what songs her daughter would have wanted. The way hope had died slowly, in stages, as each impossible dream of resurrection was methodically dismantled by the implacable machinery of grief. "I am a psychologist," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "I understand what this is. Classic wish-fulfillment fantasy triggered by extreme stress and isolation. My subconscious is creating exactly the scenario I need most: a way to save a child, a path to the daughter I lost, validation that death isn't final." It's textbook trauma response. The largest wolf tilted its head, and something in its expression reminded Elena of her old supervisor, Dr. Martinez, listening patiently to a resident's theory before gently pointing out the flaws in their logic. "And yet here you are," the wolf said, "following tracks you insist can't exist, listening to voices you claim are hallucinations, standing in a blizzard that should have killed you an hour ago." Elena's chest tightened. Because he was right. If this was psychosis, why wasn't she dead? The temperature had to be 20 below, the wind strong enough to knock her over, and she'd been hiking through wilderness for miles without proper survival gear. By every law of physics and biology, she should be experiencing severe hypothermia, should be losing cognitive function, should be lying frozen somewhere behind them on the trail. Instead, she felt strangely energized. Cold, yes, but vitally alive in a way she hadn't experienced since Sophia's death. Her mind was sharper than it had been in years, her senses hyper-aware of every detail, the intricate patterns Frost made on Nayeli's eyelashes, the way each wolf's breathing created small clouds that dissipated at different rates, the sound of her own heartbeat echoing off the trees. "What if you're wrong?" Nayeli asked, her child's voice cutting through Elena's mental spiral with devastating simplicity. "What if sometimes impossible things happen because love is stronger than the rules?" "Love doesn't bring people back from the dead, sweetheart." Elena's voice was gentle but firm, the same tone she used with her most delusional patients. "Love doesn't create magic wolves or glowing tracks in the snow. Love is just a chemical reaction that evolution designed to keep us bonded to our offspring long enough to ensure species survival. It's biochemistry, not miracles." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but they were true. They had to be true, because the alternative, that she'd spent 3 years rejecting possibilities that might have led her back to Sophia, was unbearable. Nayeli's expression grew sad, but not surprised. "She said you'd be afraid to believe. She said losing her made you forget that some things are real, even when they don't make sense." Elena's knees nearly buckled again. Please don't do this to me." "The choice is still yours," the wolf said, his voice infinitely patient. "We can guide you back to the village. You can write your report. Return to Anchorage. Continue the life you've built from fear and control. Or you can trust that love opens doors science hasn't found yet." Elena stared at the glowing tracks leading deeper into impossible darkness, and felt the weight of everything she'd lost pressing down on her shoulders like the accumulated snow of 1,000 winters. Elena closed her eyes against the swirling snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. Behind her lay everything familiar, the village with its warm houses and rational explanations, the bush plane that could carry her back to Anchorage, the carefully constructed life where grief was manageable because hope had been surgically removed. Ahead lay only darkness and impossible promises. "If I follow you," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet the wolf's golden gaze, "and there's nothing there. If this is just my mind breaking apart, I don't think I'll survive it. And if you don't follow us," Nayeli said softly, "will you survive that?" The question hit Elena like a physical blow. Because the child was right. She hadn't been surviving these past 3 years. She'd been dying incrementally, one day at a time, her heart atrophying from disuse, while she convinced herself that numbness was healing. She'd become a ghost haunting her own life, going through the motions of existence while feeling nothing, connecting to no one, living in a world drained of color and meaning. Elena thought of her empty apartment in Anchorage, its rooms echoing with Sophia's absence. The unopened mail stacked on her kitchen counter, the photos turned face down because seeing her daughter's smile had become unbearable. The phone calls from Carmen that she let go to voicemail because talking meant pretending she was okay, and pretending required energy she didn't possess. She thought of her patients, the damaged children who looked to her for healing, while she remained fundamentally broken herself. How could she teach them to hope, when she'd forgotten what hope felt like? How could she guide them toward light when she'd been stumbling through darkness for so long that she'd forgotten light existed? "She's waiting," the wolf said, and something in his voice made Elena's chest constrict with a pain so sharp it stole her breath. "She's been waiting since the moment you decided love was too dangerous to risk again." "You're asking me to believe in magic," Elena said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm a scientist. I can't just—" "You followed glowing tracks through a blizzard," Nayeli pointed out with the devastating logic only children possessed. "You're talking to wolves who speak your language. You've already believed in magic. You just won't admit it." Elena stared down at her feet, at the luminous trail that pulsed like a heartbeat in the snow. She'd been following it for miles without questioning how it was possible, driven by instincts that had nothing to do with rational thought. Maternal instincts that had overridden every professional protocol, every safety consideration, every logical argument against walking into the wilderness during an Arctic storm. The same instincts that had made her run towards Sophia's burning car, instead of waiting for firefighters. The same desperate love that had made her attempt the impossible, because the alternative, accepting loss, was unthinkable. She realized with crystalline clarity that she'd already made her choice the moment she'd stepped off the village's main path. Every footstep since then had been carrying her further from the world of scientific explanations, and closer to something that existed beyond the boundaries of everything she thought she knew. "I can't go back," she said, the words emerging as a statement of fact rather than a decision. "Even if I wanted to, I can't unknow what I've seen. I can't pretend wolves don't speak, that children don't glow in darkness, that love doesn't leave tracks in the snow." The wolf pack moved closer, forming what felt less like a circle of predators and more like a protective embrace. Their eyes held depths of understanding that made Elena feel, for the first time in 3 years, that someone truly saw her. Not the professional mask she wore, not the functional facade she presented to the world, but the broken mother beneath who had been stumbling through darkness, searching for any path back to her child. "Then come," Nayeli said, slipping her small hand into Elena's gloved one. "Come see where lost things are kept safe." Elena looked back once toward the village, its lights barely visible through the storm. Then she turned toward the glowing trail that led deeper into impossibility, and took her first step across the threshold, between the world she knew and the world she needed to exist. The snow beneath her feet felt different now. Not cold and treacherous, but solid and sure. The wind that had been trying to tear her apart now seemed to push her gently forward, and somewhere in the distance, carried on currents of Arctic air that shouldn't have been able to carry anything but death, she heard something that made her heart remember how to beat properly. Laughter, a child's laughter, bright and joyous and achingly familiar. Elena squeezed Nayeli's hand and followed the wolves into the dark, leaving behind everything she'd been and walking toward everything she might become. Chapter 6, Tests and Allies. The laughter faded as they moved deeper into the forest, replaced by a silence so profound Elena could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The glowing trail beneath their feet pulsed with increasing frequency, as if responding to their proximity to some unseen destination. With each step, the rules of the world she'd known seemed to bend further, reality becoming as fluid as the shifting snow around them. "How much further?" Elena asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The fear that had paralyzed her earlier was still there, but it had transformed into something sharper, more focused, the kind of alert readiness she'd felt in trauma wards when every decision could mean the difference between saving a life and losing one. "Distance works differently here," Nayeli replied, her small hand warm and solid in Elena's grasp. "It's not about miles, it's about willingness." As if summoned by her words, the trees ahead began to thin, revealing what Elena first mistook for a massive snowdrift. Then her perception shifted, and she realized she was looking at a structure, an enormous mound of ice and stone that rose from the forest floor like a cathedral carved from winter itself. The aurora borealis danced across its surface, but the lights weren't coming from the sky. They emanated from within the structure, pulsing through translucent walls of ice in patterns that reminded Elena of neural networks firing. "The sanctuary," the largest wolf said, his voice carrying reverence that made Elena's chest tighten. "Where those who are lost find their way to those who seek them." Elena stopped walking, her scientific mind recoiling even as her heart lurched forward. This isn't possible. Structures like this don't just exist in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. There would be satellite imagery, geological surveys. "There are many things that exist beyond your maps, Dr. Vasquez." The voice came from behind them, and Elena spun around to find an elderly Inuit woman emerging from between the trees. She moved with the fluid grace of someone much younger, her weathered face serene despite the storm. "I am Nuka, elder of the old ways. I have been waiting to meet you." Elena's pulse quickened. This was clearly a member of Nayeli's family, someone from the village who could provide rational explanations. Thank goodness. "I found Nayeli, but we need to get her back immediately. The weather conditions—" "Are no danger to her," Nuka interrupted gently. "Nor to you, as long as you remain on the path. But there are rules here, Dr. Vasquez. Laws that govern this place which are older and more fundamental than the ones you learned in your universities." "What kind of rules?" Elena asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Nuka gestured toward the ice structure, where shapes were beginning to move behind the translucent walls. "The sanctuary exists in the space between worlds, between the realm of the living and the place where love goes when death tries to break it. To enter, you must offer something of equal value to what you seek." Elena's mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" "It means," Nayeli said, turning to face Elena with eyes that held too much understanding for a 6-year-old, "that if you want to see her again, you have to give up the thing that's been keeping you from her." "I don't understand." But Elena did understand, with the horrible clarity that comes with recognizing a truth you've been running from. "What have I been keeping? I've given up everything for her memory. My career, my relationships, my ability to feel joy." "Your fear," Nuka said simply. "You've been holding on to your fear so tightly that there's been no room for anything else. Fear of hoping, fear of believing, fear of opening your heart to possibilities that might hurt you again. Fear has become your armor, but it's also become your prison." The wolves had arranged themselves in a semicircle around the group, their eyes reflecting the aurora's dance. Elena realized they weren't just watching, they were waiting. This was a test, she understood with crystalline certainty, not just of her courage, but of her capacity to choose love over self-protection. "If I let go of the fear," Elena said slowly, "and there's nothing inside, if Sophia isn't waiting, what happens to me then?" "Then you'll have learned something true about the nature of love," Nuka replied. "That it exists beyond presence and absence, beyond life and death. That it changes form but never dies. That sometimes the greatest gift we can give those we've lost is the willingness to be transformed by having loved them." Elena stared at the glowing structure, where shadows moved with purpose behind walls of living ice. Her daughter could be inside, or her daughter could be gone forever, and this could be an elaborate hallucination designed by her mind to process unbearable loss. There was no way to know except to surrender the very defenses that had kept her functioning for 3 years. "Dr. Vasquez," Nayeli said softly, "she said to tell you that being brave enough to hope again would be the best birthday present you could give her." Elena's knees nearly buckled. Sophia's birthday was in 2 weeks, would have been her 10th. Elena had been dreading it for months. She closed her eyes, took a shuddering breath, and chose to trust love over fear. Chapter 7, The Approach. The silence that followed Elena's surrender stretched like ice across still water. When she opened her eyes, the sanctuary seemed closer, its translucent walls now revealing more distinct shapes moving within, figures that walked with the fluid grace of those unbound by ordinary physical laws. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to distinguish individual forms, searching desperately for one familiar silhouette among the dancing shadows. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the aurora's electric whisper. Nuka stepped forward, her ancient face grave with the weight of ritual. "Now you must prepare yourself for what lies within. The sanctuary shows each visitor what they most need to see, but not always what they expect to find. Some enter seeking the dead and discover the living. Others search for the lost and find themselves." Elena felt the first crack appear in her newfound resolve. "You're saying Sophia might not be there?" "I'm saying she might not be there in the way you remember her," Nuka replied, her weathered hand coming to rest on Elena's shoulder. 3 years have passed in your world. Time moves differently here, but it still moves. Children grow, even in the space between worlds, especially there. The possibility hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd held Sophia's image frozen at age 6, gap-toothed smile, tangled hair that refused to stay in braids, small hands that always seemed to be sticky with something inexplicable. But if Sophia had continued to exist somewhere, continued to grow, Elena realized she might not even recognize her own daughter. "Dr. Vasquez," Nayeli said, tugging gently on Elena's coat, "are you scared of her being different?" Elena knelt in the snow, bringing herself to eye level with the child. In Nayeli's dark eyes, she saw reflections of every lost child she'd ever tried to help, every parent she'd counseled through impossible grief. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "What if she doesn't remember me? What if she's angry that I couldn't save her? What if—" Her voice cracked. "What if she's better off without me?" The largest wolf padded closer, his massive head tilting with something that looked remarkably like compassion. "Love doesn't diminish with change, Dr. Vasquez. It deepens. The child you lost and the being she has become are not separate things. They are movements in the same eternal song." "But I don't know how to love someone I don't know," Elena said, the words emerging from a place of raw honesty she'd kept buried for years. "I built my entire identity around being Sophia's mother. Without that specific relationship, that specific version of her that I could protect and guide and hold, who am I?" Nuka crouched beside them, her voice carrying the weight of countless generations who had faced similar crossings. "You are about to discover that, child. The sanctuary doesn't just reunite the living with the lost. It teaches us who we become when we love beyond the boundaries of our own understanding." Elena looked back toward the glowing structure, and for the first time noticed that its walls weren't solid ice as she'd assumed. They were composed of what looked like crystallized memories, images that shifted and flowed within the frozen surface. She could see glimpses of moments that felt familiar yet impossible. A woman who looked like her older sister reading to a girl who might have been Sophia. An elderly man teaching a child to carve something from wood. Families gathered around fires that burned without fuel, their faces radiant with a joy that transcended ordinary happiness. "Those are the others," Nayeli explained, following Elena's gaze. "The ones who found their way here before you. Some came looking for children, some for parents, some for love they thought they'd lost forever. They all had to learn the same thing you're learning, which is that love isn't about holding on," Nuka said, rising to her feet and extending her hand toward the sanctuary. "It's about letting go enough to let love transform into what it needs to become." As they approached the structure's entrance, an archway that seemed to form itself from swirling snow and northern lights, Elena felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart beginning to crumble. For 3 years, she'd armored herself in grief, using the pain of loss as protection against the vulnerability of hope. She'd convinced herself that faithfully maintaining her sorrow was a form of devotion, that healing would be a betrayal of Sophia's memory. But standing at the threshold between worlds, Elena finally understood that her fear of letting go had been keeping her daughter at arm's length all along. If Sophia existed somewhere beyond death, Elena's rigid grip on the past might be the very thing preventing their reunion. The wolves formed a protective circle around them as Nuka placed her palm against the ice archway. The surface began to glow more brightly, and Elena heard something that made her soul remember how to sing, the sound of children laughing, playing, learning, living in a way that transcended the boundaries between existence and memory. Elena stepped toward the entrance, her heart finally open enough to hold whatever love looked like beyond the grave. Chapter 8. The ordeal begins. The moment Elena crossed the threshold, the world inverted. She found herself standing not in an ice cathedral, but in a vast space that defied geometry. Walls that curved upward into infinity, floors that rippled like water beneath her feet, air that shimmered with the essence of every season simultaneously. The aurora lights weren't coming from above anymore. They emanated from the beings that moved through this impossible realm, each one carrying their own constellation of memory and longing. And there, in the center of it all, sat a girl. Elena's breath caught. The child was perhaps 9 years old, with Sophia's dark hair but longer now, braided with threads of light that moved like living things. She wore clothes that seemed woven from starlight and snow, and when she looked up at Elena's approach, her eyes held depths of wisdom that no 6-year-old should possess. "Hello, Mama," the girl said, and Elena's world shattered. This was Sophia. She could feel it in every cell of her body, the recognition that surpassed sight or sound or logical thought. But this was also a stranger, a being who had grown and changed in ways that belonged to realms Elena couldn't comprehend. The gap-toothed smile was gone, replaced by something more radiant and terrible, the serene expression of someone who had learned truths about existence that mortals spend lifetimes seeking. "I've been waiting," Sophia said, rising gracefully to her feet. "But I wasn't sure you'd be brave enough to let yourself see me as I am now." Elena tried to speak, but found her voice trapped behind 3 years of frozen grief. She had prepared herself for many possibilities, for Sophia to be angry, to be lost, to be exactly as she remembered. She had not prepared for her daughter to have become something magnificent and unreachable. "You're afraid of me," Sophia observed with devastating gentleness. "You wanted your baby back, and instead you found someone you don't know how to love." The words hit Elena like physical blows. "That's not, I do know how." But the lie crumbled before she could complete it. She was afraid, terrified. This wise, luminous being bore only traces of the child Elena had defined herself by protecting, and without that familiar dynamic, she felt unmoored from her own identity. "Do you know what I learned here?" Sophia asked, beginning to walk in a slow circle around Elena. With each step, the space around them shifted, showing glimpses of the life Elena had tried to build in her daughter's absence, the empty apartment, the turned-down photographs, the patients she couldn't heal because she'd forgotten how to believe in healing. "I learned that love isn't about keeping someone small enough to fit inside your understanding of them." Elena watched herself through her daughter's eyes, 3 years of diminishment and retreat, of choosing numbness over growth, of worshipping an image of Sophia that had become more real to her than Sophia herself had ever been. She saw how her grief had calcified into something selfish, a shrine to her own pain rather than a celebration of her daughter's existence. "I learned," Sophia continued, "that when you love someone, you have to be brave enough to let them become who they're meant to be, even if that person is someone you never could have imagined." The air around them began to pulse with increasing intensity, and Elena realized that other beings were gathering, the shapes she'd glimpsed through the sanctuary's walls, children and adults who glowed with their own inner light, all watching this reunion with expressions of infinite compassion. Among them she recognized some faces from her dreams, patients she'd lost over the years, souls who had found their way to this place between worlds. "The question isn't whether you can love me as I am now," Sophia said, stopping directly in front of Elena. "The question is whether you're ready to become someone capable of that love, because the mother who could love me in this form doesn't exist yet. She's someone you'd have to choose to become." Elena felt the full weight of the ordeal settle around her like Arctic wind. This wasn't just about accepting her daughter's transformation, it was about dismantling everything she thought she knew about love, motherhood, and the boundaries of existence itself, It meant releasing her grip on the familiar grief that had become her identity and stepping into a version of herself that didn't yet exist. "I don't know how," Elena whispered, the admission torn from the deepest part of her soul. Sophia smiled then. And in that expression, Elena caught a glimpse of the 6-year-old who had once fallen asleep in her lap during bedtime stories. "The same way you did everything else, Mama. One impossible step at a time." The beings around them began to emit a low, harmonic sound. Not quite singing, not quite prayer. Elena realized they were offering her their strength, their understanding, their hard-won wisdom about love that transcends form and time and death itself. Standing at the center of impossible grace, Elena faced the most terrifying choice of her life: remain the mother she had been, or become the mother love demanded she evolve into. Chapter 9. The Dark Moment. The harmonious sound of the assembled beings faded into expectant silence, and Elena felt the weight of choice pressing down on her like the Arctic wind above. She looked at Sophia, this radiant stranger who carried her daughter's essence but had grown beyond Elena's ability to recognize, and felt something fundamental break apart inside her chest. "I can't," Elena whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I want to, but I can't. I don't know how to love someone I don't understand. I don't know how to be the mother of someone who doesn't need me anymore." Sophia's luminous expression dimmed slightly, though her voice remained gentle. "What do you think love is, Mama?" "It's protection," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with desperate conviction. "It's knowing what you need before you need it. It's being able to heal your hurts and guide your choices and keep you safe from a world that wants to destroy beautiful things." The words poured out of her like a dam breaking. "But look at you. You're beyond all of that. You've become something I could never protect, never guide, never even understand. You don't need a mother anymore. You need, I don't know what you need." The space around them began to shift ominously, the walls that had seemed infinite now pressing closer. The other beings started to fade at their edges, as if Elena's words were dissolving the very fabric that held this realm together. "Elena." Nuka's voice reached her from somewhere beyond the dissolving sanctuary. "Remember why you came here?" But Elena was lost now in the spiral of her own inadequacy. "I came here to find my daughter," she said, her voice cracking. "I came here to save a 6-year-old who needed her mother. But she's gone, isn't she? She was gone the moment the cancer took her, and I've been chasing a ghost, a fantasy, a delusion built from my own selfish need to matter to someone." Sophia took a step back, and Elena saw something she'd never seen in her daughter's face before: disappointment. Not anger, not hurt, but the quiet resignation of someone whose faith has been misplaced. "You're going to leave," Sophia said, and it wasn't a question. Elena felt the truth of it settle into her bones like poison. "I don't know how to stay. I built myself around loving a little girl who needed me, and you're magnificent, Sophia. You're everything I ever dreamed you could become, but you're not mine anymore. Maybe you never were. Maybe I was just borrowing you for 6 years, and the real work, the work of becoming who you were meant to be, was something you had to do without me." The sanctuary continued to collapse inward, its crystalline walls cracking with sounds like breaking hearts. The other beings were disappearing one by one, their forms dissolving back into memory and starlight. Elena realized with growing horror that her inability to transform was unraveling this entire realm, taking with it not just her chance at reunion, but the sanctuary that countless others had found. "No." Nayeli's small voice cut through the destruction. The Inuit girl appeared beside Sophia, her own form beginning to flicker. "Dr. Vasquez, if you leave now, if you choose fear again, we all go back to being lost. All of us." Elena looked around at the fading beings, children and parents who had found each other across impossible distances, families reunited beyond the boundaries of death, souls who had learned to love without limits. Her choice wasn't just about her and Sophia anymore. It was about whether love could exist without possession, whether connection could survive transformation, whether hope was stronger than the human need for familiar ground. "I'm broken," Elena said, The admission scraped from the deepest part of her failing. 3 years ago, I was whole because I knew how to love her. Now I'm standing in front of the most important person in my existence, and I can feel myself shattering because she's outgrown my capacity to understand what love means. Sophia's form was growing translucent now, the threads of light in her hair dimming to ordinary brown. "Then maybe," she said softly, "you need to let yourself break all the way open. Maybe that's the only way to become big enough for this kind of love." But Elena was already backing toward the entrance, her scientist's mind screaming that this was all an elaborate hallucination, her mother's heart too small and frightened to risk transformation. The familiar weight of grief settled around her shoulders like an old coat, painful but known, limiting but safe. "I'm sorry," she whispered as the sanctuary crumbled around them. "I'm so sorry I'm not brave enough to become who you need me to be." The last thing Elena saw before the realm collapsed entirely was Sophia's face. Not angry, not accusing, but infinitely sad for a mother who had traveled so far only to discover that the greatest distance she needed to cross was the one within herself. Then Elena was falling through ice and starlight, back toward a world where love had boundaries, and mothers knew their place and daughters stayed safely small in memory rather than growing large in truth. Chapter 10. The Revelation. Elena hit the snow-covered ground outside the ice cave with a force that should have shattered every bone in her body, but the impact felt strangely gentle, as if the earth itself was cushioning her fall. She lay there gasping in the sub-zero air, her breath forming clouds that dissipated into the star-drunk Alaska night, and for a moment she wondered if she was dead. The physical world felt wrong after the impossible geometry of the sanctuary, too rigid, too small, too bound by laws that suddenly seemed arbitrary. The aurora still danced overhead, but its light felt muted now, like a symphony heard through thick walls. Even her own body felt foreign, as if she'd tried to pour an ocean into a teacup and wondered why everything had spilled out. She struggled to her feet, snow falling from her coat, and looked back at the cave entrance. It appeared ordinary now, just another gap in the rock face, dark and unremarkable. No crystalline walls, no impossible light, no trace of the realm that had just collapsed under the weight of her own limitations. But the silence that pressed against her ears wasn't the simple quiet of an Arctic night. It was the silence of absence, of a door slammed shut, of opportunities that might not come again. "Dr. Vasquez?" Elena turned to find Nayeli standing 20 feet away. But something was wrong. The child looked exactly as she had before, 6 years old, bundled in her traditional parka, brown eyes wide with concern, but the ancient wisdom that had radiated from her in the sanctuary was gone. She looked like what she had always been, a little girl who should have been home hours ago, confused and cold and frightened. The wolves were gone. "Nayeli," Elena breathed, stumbling toward the child through the deep snow. "Are you okay? Do you remember?" But even as she asked, Elena could see in the girl's expression that the memory was already fading. Nayeli tilted her head with the particular confusion of someone trying to recall a dream after waking. "I was following something," Nayeli said slowly. "A wolf, I think." But then she frowned, pressing small gloved hands to her temples. "I can't remember. I was somewhere warm, and there were voices, and you were there. But you look different. Sadder." Elena felt something crack open in her chest, not the breaking she'd feared in the sanctuary, but something deeper. A recognition that was part revelation and part condemnation. She had been given the chance to witness a miracle, to step into a love larger than anything she'd imagined possible, and she had chosen the familiar prison of her own grief instead. But worse than her personal failure was what she now understood about the child standing before her. Nayeli's gift, her ability to communicate with the lost souls who rode the aurora between worlds, hadn't been some permanent mystical endowment. It had been a doorway opened by the same forces that had brought Elena to this place, and Elena's retreat had slammed it shut. The ancient wisdom in the child's eyes was gone because the connection itself had been severed. "You were speaking to them," Elena said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "The wolves, the children in the light. You were translating between worlds, helping families find each other across impossible distances. And the words lodged in her throat like shards of ice. Nayeli shrugged with the casual resilience of childhood. I dream about voices sometimes. Mama says it's just the wind. She looked around the empty landscape, suddenly seeming very small against the vast darkness. We should go home. It's cold, and I think I'm in trouble for wandering off again. Elena knelt in the snow, bringing herself to eye level with the child who had been, minutes ago, a bridge between the living and the lost. In Nayeli's matter-of-fact acceptance of her fading memories, Elena saw reflected her own cowardice. The girl had been willing to serve as a conduit for impossible love, to let herself be transformed into something larger and stranger and more magnificent than any 6-year-old should have to become. And Elena had met her daughter's transcendent evolution with nothing but fear. Nayeli, she said carefully, what do you remember about tonight? The child considered this with the serious attention she might give to a teacher's question. I remember you were very sad, sadder than the other sad grown-ups who come to the village sometimes. And I remember thinking that someone was trying to help you, but you kept saying no. She paused, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Why do grown-ups always say no to help? The question hit Elena like a physical blow. In a child's simple observation, she heard the terrible truth about her own journey to this place. She had come to Alaska convinced she was seeking her daughter, but what she had really been seeking was confirmation of her own narrative, the story where she was the grieving mother, heroically faithful to a memory, justified in her refusal to heal or grow or change. Standing in the snow under the dimming aurora, Elena finally understood that her love for Sophia had become a monument to her own pain, rather than a celebration of her daughter's existence. She had wrapped herself so tightly in the identity of loss that she couldn't recognize love when it offered to transform her into something larger. The revelation settled into her bones like the Arctic cold. She had been offered resurrection, not just Sophia's, but her own. And she had chosen death instead. Elena stood in the bitter wind, Nayeli's innocent question echoing in her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Why do grown-ups always say no to help? The words stripped away every excuse she'd built, every rationalization for her retreat from the sanctuary, leaving only the raw truth. She had been offered something extraordinary, and had chosen familiar suffering instead. But in that moment of complete self-recognition, something unexpected began to happen. The numbness that had defined the last 3 years, the careful distance she'd maintained from her own emotions, from her patience, from life itself, started to crack. Not the gentle breaking she'd feared, but something more like ice giving way to spring thaw, painful but necessary. You're right, Elena said to Nayeli, her voice steady despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. Grown-ups do say no to help. We get scared of changing, of becoming different than who we think we're supposed to be. She paused, looking up at the aurora that still painted the sky in impossible colors. But maybe it's not too late to say yes. Nayeli studied her with the penetrating attention children reserve for adults they're trying to figure out. You want to go back to the warm place? It wasn't a question, and Elena felt something shift in her chest. Not the desperate grasping she'd felt before, but a quieter recognition. I don't know if I can. I think I broke something important when I left. Mama says broken things can be fixed if you have the right tools, Nayeli offered pragmatically. What tools do you need? Elena almost smiled despite everything. Leave it to a child to reduce cosmic transformation to a practical problem. But as she considered the question seriously, she began to understand that Nayeli was offering more than childish comfort. The girl might not remember the full extent of what had happened, but some deeper part of her still carried the wisdom of someone who had served as a bridge between worlds. I think, Elena said slowly, I need to stop trying to love Sophia the way I used to love her. I need to learn how to love who she's become, even if that's someone I can't protect or guide or fully understand. The admission felt like stepping off solid ground, but for the first time in 3 years, Elena didn't feel the familiar panic that came with uncertainty. Instead, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Curiosity about who she might become if she stopped clinging so tightly to who she had been. "The voices I hear sometimes," Nayeli said quietly, "they're not scary. They're just different. Like when grandfather speaks Inupiaq and I don't understand all the words, but I understand the feeling behind them." She kicked at the snow with one small boot. "Maybe love is like that too. You don't have to understand all the words." Elena felt her breath catch. In a 6-year-old's simple wisdom, she glimpsed the truth that had eluded her in the sanctuary. Love wasn't about comprehension or control. It was about presence, about showing up fully to whatever was offered, even when, especially when, it exceeded her ability to process or define it. "Nayeli," Elena said, decision crystallizing in her voice, "if I tried to find that warm place again, would you help me?" The child's face brightened with an expression that seemed to carry echoes of her former luminescence. "The wolves like you more than you think," she said matter-of-factly. "They told me you smell like someone who's been carrying too much for too long. They wanted to help carry some of it." Elena felt something unlock in her chest. Not the desperate hope she'd carried to Alaska, but something steadier, a recognition that she wasn't facing this transformation alone. The village that had welcomed her, Nuka's patient guidance, Nayeli's willingness to serve as interpreter between worlds, even the wolves who had seen past her fear to the grief beneath, they were all offering to help her become large enough for the love that waited. "Then let's find them," Elena said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Let's find the wolves, and the warm place, and—" She paused, the next words feeling like a prayer. "Let's find Sophia again. The real Sophia, not just the one who lives in my memories." Nayeli nodded seriously, then did something unexpected. She reached up and took Elena's gloved hand in her small one, the gesture so natural and trusting that Elena felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble completely. "It's easier with help," the child said simply. Standing in the Arctic night with a 6-year-old's hand in hers, Elena understood that this was how transformation actually happened, not in grand gestures of sudden enlightenment, but in small moments of choosing courage over comfort, growth over familiarity, love over the illusion of control. The aurora pulsed brighter overhead, and Elena could have sworn she heard, carried on the wind, the distant sound of wolves calling to each other across the vast darkness, a sound that no longer seemed like threat, but like invitation. The wolves' call came again, closer this time, and Elena felt her heart leap, not with fear but with recognition. She squeezed Nayeli's small hand and started walking toward the sound, each step feeling like a commitment to something larger than her own understanding. "Dr. Vasquez," Nayeli said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that made Elena pause. "Before we find them, you need to know something. The warm place, it changes people. Not on the outside, but inside. If you go back, you won't be the same person who came to Alaska." Elena considered this, feeling the weight of the child's warning. 3 years ago, the thought of fundamental change would have terrified her. She had built her identity so carefully around being Sophia's mother, around the particular shape of her grief, around the familiar rhythms of her controlled, distant life. To lose those things felt like losing herself entirely. But standing in the Arctic darkness, she realized she had already lost herself, not to transformation but to stagnation, not to growth, but to the desperate attempt to remain unchanged in a world that demanded evolution. The Elena who had arrived in Alaska was already a ghost, haunting her own life, clinging to the shadows of someone she used to be. "Good," she said finally. "I don't want to be the same person. That person couldn't love her daughter enough to let her grow beyond death. That person chose familiar pain over incomprehensible joy." A figure emerged from the tree line ahead, Nuka, moving with the patient certainty of someone who had been waiting. As she approached, Elena saw in the older woman's face a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pride. "You came back," Nuka said simply. "I ran away," Elena admitted. "When it mattered most, when Sophia needed me to be brave enough to love who she'd become, I chose my own limitations instead." Nuka nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had witnessed many people wrestle with transformation. The sanctuary rebuilds itself. Love is more persistent than fear, though fear is louder. She gestured toward the darkness beyond the trees. But this time will be different. This time, the door you open may not close again. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind. What do you mean? The first time, you were a visitor, Nuka explained. You could leave, return to your old life, pretend none of this happened. But if you choose to go back now, knowing what waits there, understanding what it means, you become part of it. The love that connects your daughter to this place, to the other lost ones, to the spaces between worlds, it becomes part of who you are. The implications settled over Elena like a blanket of stars. She thought of her practice in Anchorage, her carefully ordered life, her apartment where she had preserved Sophia's room like a shrine to her own inability to heal. If she stepped through that doorway again, could she return to pretending that grief was the highest form of love? Could she go back to helping other families navigate loss while remaining lost herself? There are consequences, she said, not quite a question. There are always consequences to love, Nuka replied. The question is whether you're willing to face them. Elena looked down at Nayeli, whose small face was serious in the aurora light. The child had already paid the price for Elena's first failure, her gift diminished, her connection to the impossible realm severed by Elena's retreat. But she was here anyway, offering to help guide Elena back to what she had abandoned. From somewhere in the darkness came another wolf call, longer this time, mournful and beautiful. Elena realized that she was standing at the exact moment the previous chapter's objective had warned about, the point where she must commit to finishing what she started, where the consequences of her earlier choices demanded reckoning, where the final confrontation with her own transformation could no longer be delayed. If I do this, Elena said slowly, if I go back and find her again, I might not be able to be the mother I was before. I might not know how to love her the way I used to. No, Nuka agreed. You might have to learn to love her the way she is now, and yourself the way you're becoming. Elena felt the last of her resistance crumble, not with the violence of breaking, but with the gentle inevitability of snow melting in spring. The choice before her was no longer between finding Sophia and losing her, it was between growing large enough to love transcendently or remaining small enough to love safely. She thought of the other beings in the sanctuary, the families who had found each other across impossible distances, the love that existed beyond the boundaries of death and time and understanding. She thought of Sophia as she had appeared in that crystalline realm, magnificent, evolved, more herself than she had ever been in life. Then let's finish this, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Let's find the sanctuary again, and this time, I won't run from what love looks like when it outgrows death. The wolves called again, and Elena began walking toward the sound with the certainty of someone who had finally chosen transformation over safety, growth over grief, love over the illusion of control. The first test came before they had gone 50 yards. Elena felt it like a physical weight settling onto her shoulders, not the familiar burden of grief she had carried for 3 years, but something far more demanding. The aurora above them began to pulse with increasing intensity, and with each flash of light, Elena found herself reliving moments from Sophia's short life with crystalline clarity. But these weren't the sanitized memories she had polished to perfection in her grief. These were the raw, unedited moments she had buried. Sophia's tantrum in the grocery store when Elena snapped at her for being too loud. The morning Elena had been too rushed to read the bedtime stories Sophia requested. The countless small failures of patience, presence, and perfect love that every parent accumulates, but rarely forgives themselves for. The first test is always honesty, Nuka said quietly, keeping pace beside her as they moved deeper into the trees. You cannot love transcendently until you love truly. Elena's steps faltered as another memory surfaced, the last conversation she and Sophia had ever had, the one she had rewritten in her mind 1,000 times. In her careful reconstruction they had spoken of love and dreams, and Sophia's plans for the future. But the truth was starker, more human, more heartbreaking in its ordinariness. Sophia had asked for 5 more minutes of cartoons before bed, and Elena had said no, they were already running late, that Sophia needed to brush her teeth immediately. "I wasn't perfect," Elena whispered, the admission feeling like tearing something vital from her chest. "I was tired and impatient, and I took her for granted because I thought we had forever to get it right." "Yes," Nuka said simply. The word hung in the Arctic air like a judgment, but as Elena waited for the crushing weight of guilt to follow, she found something else instead: relief. For 3 years, she had tried to honor Sophia's memory by pretending their relationship had been flawless, by transforming herself into the perfect grieving mother of the perfect lost child. But love built on idealization wasn't love at all. It was worship of her own construction, not recognition of who Sophia had actually been. The wolves appeared ahead of them, their eyes reflecting the aurora light like stars fallen to earth. The massive grey who had carried Nayeli stepped forward, and Elena saw in his ancient gaze not judgment for her imperfections, but acknowledgement of them. He had seen past her careful facades from the beginning, had recognized the human struggling beneath the myth she had created about herself. Nayeli released Elena's hand and moved toward the wolves with easy familiarity. As she did, Elena felt the second test beginning, a pulling sensation deep in her chest, as if something vital was being drawn out of her and examined. Her identity as the grieving mother, the role that had defined her for 3 years, began to separate from her like a skin being shed. She felt herself becoming unmoored from the careful structure she had built around her pain, and the sensation was terrifying. If she wasn't the woman whose world had ended with Sophia's death, if she wasn't the mother who loved so perfectly that she couldn't heal, then who was she? "I don't know who I am without the grief," Elena said, her voice breaking. "It's been the only thing that felt real, the only way I knew how to honor her." Nuka stopped walking and turned to face her. In the older woman's eyes, Elena saw not pity but recognition, the look of someone who had undergone this same dissolution and emerged, transformed. "You are Elena," Nuka said. "Not Elena who lost Sophia, not Elena the grieving mother, not Elena defined by tragedy. Just Elena, complex, flawed, capable of love that grows instead of calcifies, capable of honoring the dead by fully inhabiting life." The wolves began to move again, and Elena understood that this was the moment of ultimate choice. Every lesson she had learned in this impossible place, about love that transcends death, about the courage required for true connection, about the difference between honoring memory and being imprisoned by it, had brought her to this threshold. But the final test wasn't about understanding. It was about faith. Elena closed her eyes and let go of everything she thought she knew about who she was supposed to be. She released her grip on the familiar pain that had been her companion for so long, on the identity that felt safe because it was comprehensible, on the version of love that demanded no growth or change or risk. When she opened her eyes, the world looked different. Not transformed in any dramatic way, but somehow more present, more immediate, as if she had been viewing everything through glass, and someone had just removed the barrier. The wolves were waiting, their posture patient but alert. Nayeli stood among them, her small face solemn with understanding. The aurora painted everything in shades of impossible beauty. Elena took a breath that felt like the first breath she had taken in years, and stepped forward into whatever waited beyond the boundaries of everything she had thought love could be. The sanctuary manifested around them like a dream crystallizing into reality, but this time, Elena felt the weight of her transformed perspective immediately. The crystalline walls that had overwhelmed her before now seemed to pulse with familiar warmth, and the voices that had once threatened to drown her consciousness now wove themselves into a symphony of connection that made her heart ache with recognition rather than fear. But something was wrong. Where the space had once thrummed with harmonious energy, Elena now sensed a disturbance, a darkness that seemed to feed on the very love that gave the sanctuary its power. The walls flickered, their luminescence unstable, and the voices of the lost children carried an undertone of distress that made Elena's newly awakened maternal instincts surge with protective fury. "She's here," Nayeli whispered, her small hand finding Elena's with desperate urgency. "The hungry one. She's been waiting for you to come back." Elena felt her skin prickle with more than cold as a figure materialized from the shifting crystalline depths, herself, but wrong, fundamentally corrupted. This other Elena moved with the fluid grace of something that had never doubted its righteousness, never questioned the purity of its love, never allowed itself to be transformed by growth or challenge. Her face bore the terrible beauty of absolute conviction, and her eyes held the flat certainty of someone who had chosen perfection over truth. "You abandoned her," the shadow Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of every guilt Elena had ever carried. "You left our daughter alone in this place because you weren't strong enough to love her properly. You failed her in life, and then you failed her in death." Elena felt the familiar claws of self-recrimination begin to dig into her consciousness, but something had changed. Where once she would have collapsed under the weight of her own guilt, she now found herself standing straighter, drawing strength from her hard-won understanding of love's true nature. "I did fail her," Elena said quietly. "I failed her by trying to love her perfectly instead of honestly. I failed her by making my grief more important than her growth. I failed her by choosing the safety of my own pain over the risk of letting her become who she needed to be." The shadow Elena's expression flickered with surprise, then hardened into something cruel. "And now you think that admission makes you worthy, that confessing your failures erases them?" Around them, the sanctuary shuddered, and Elena could feel the other presences, Sophia, the lost children, the families who had found each other across impossible distances, all watching this confrontation with the intensity of those whose existence hung in the balance. This wasn't just about Elena's personal transformation anymore. This was about whether love could truly transcend its own limitations, whether the sanctuary itself could survive the collision between perfected grief and imperfect growth. "I don't think I'm worthy," Elena said, feeling the truth of the words settle into her bones. "I think love isn't about worthiness, it's about presence. It's about showing up as who you actually are, not who you think you should be." The shadow Elena laughed, a sound like glass breaking. How convenient. How perfectly human to redefine love when the original version becomes too demanding. She gestured toward the flickering walls. "Look around you. This place exists because of perfect love, transcendent love, love that doesn't compromise or settle or make excuses for its failures." But even as she spoke, Elena could see the lie beneath the words. The sanctuary was weakening not because Elena had brought imperfection into it, but because the shadow Elena's presence was feeding on its energy like a parasite, transforming love into possession, connection into control, transcendence into tyranny. "No," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. "This place exists because love is powerful enough to survive its own imperfections. Because real love grows and changes and makes mistakes and learns and becomes more than it was. Your version of love is just elaborate selfishness. It's about you feeling worthy, you being perfect, you never having to face the possibility that love might require you to become someone new." The shadow Elena's face contorted with rage, and Elena felt the full force of her own capacity for self-destruction turned against her. Every moment of weakness, every failure of patience, every time she had chosen her own comfort over Sophia's needs, all of it crashed down on her consciousness like a tsunami of accusation. But Elena didn't run from it this time. Instead, she opened herself to it completely, letting the weight of her human limitations flow through her without resistance. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, she felt something she had never experienced before. Compassion for her own imperfection, love that didn't require perfection as its foundation. "I forgive you," Elena said to her shadow self, and the words carried the power of absolute truth. "I forgive you for not being perfect. I forgive you for failing. I forgive you for being human." The shadow Elena screamed, a sound that shattered crystal and sent shockwaves through the sanctuary's foundation, and Elena stepped forward to face the deepest confrontation of all, learning to love herself enough to love Sophia truly. The shadow Elena's scream reverberated through the crystalline chamber, but instead of dissolving under Elena's forgiveness, she seemed to draw power from some deeper well of anguish. Her form solidified, becoming more real, more present, until Elena could see every line of familiar pain etched into features that mirrored her own. "Forgiveness," the shadow Elena snarled. "You think that's what this is about? You think you can absolve yourself with pretty words and move on to some sanitized version of love that doesn't demand everything?" The sanctuary around them began to fracture more violently, hairline cracks spreading through walls that had once seemed indestructible. Elena felt the terror of the lost children, their voices rising in desperate harmony as their refuge, perhaps their very existence, trembled on the edge of dissolution. And then she saw Sophia. Her daughter materialized at the far end of the chamber, but not as the evolved, transcendent being Elena had glimpsed before. This Sophia was exactly as she had been in life, 6 years old, wearing the purple pajamas she had died in, her face streaked with tears that broke Elena's heart into fragments smaller than the crystal dust falling around them. "Mummy," Sophia whispered, and the word carried 3 years of waiting, of confusion, of a child's incomprehension at being left alone in a place that existed beyond death itself. Elena started toward her daughter, but the shadow Elena stepped into her path, and Elena suddenly understood the true nature of the trap she had walked into. This wasn't about defeating her dark reflection, it was about choosing between 2 different versions of Sophia. The transcendent child who had outgrown death and become something magnificent, or the lost little girl who had never been allowed to heal because Elena's grief had kept her frozen in the moment of trauma. "Choose," the shadow Elena commanded. "Save the daughter you remember, or abandon her for whatever she's supposedly become. But you cannot have both. Love demands sacrifice, Elena. It always has." Elena felt the weight of the decision crushing down on her, like the collapse of the crystalline ceiling above. Around them, the other lost children were flickering in and out of existence, their connections to the sanctuary dependent on the love that held this place together. Love that was now fragmenting under the pressure of an impossible choice. But as Elena looked at her daughter's tear-stained face, she realized that the choice itself was the lie. Love didn't demand choosing between who Sophia had been and who she could become. Love demanded letting go of Elena's need to control which version she was allowed to love. "I choose her," Elena said quietly. "Which her?" The shadow Elena demanded triumphantly. "Both of them. All of them. Every version of her that ever was or ever could be." Elena felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, a tearing sensation that was simultaneously agony and relief. "I choose to love the frightened little girl who died confused and alone. I choose to love the transcendent being she became when she learned to exist beyond death. I choose to love whoever she might become next, even if I can't understand it, even if it means I have to let go of being the kind of mother I thought I was supposed to be." The shadow Elena's face twisted with fury, and something that might have been grief. "And what about you? What about your pain, your loss, your right to mourn? If you let her go, if you stop holding on to who she was, what's left of your love for her?" Elena felt the answer rise from somewhere deeper than thought, deeper than the carefully constructed identity she had built around her grief. And with it came the understanding of what the sacrifice would truly cost her. "I give up being her mother," Elena said, the words tearing from her throat like pieces of her soul. "I give up the right to define who she is or what she needs. I give up the comfort of familiar grief. I give up the safety of loving someone who can't grow beyond my understanding of love." The crystalline chamber shuddered as if the sanctuary itself was gasping. Elena felt the magnitude of what she was releasing, not Sophia but her claim on Sophia. Not her love, but her ownership of love. The identity that had sustained her through 3 years of anguish was dissolving, leaving behind something she had never allowed herself to be, not Sophia's mother, not Elena the grieving woman, but simply Elena, capable of loving without possessing, of honoring without controlling, of letting go without abandoning. The shadow Elena began to fade, her rage transforming into something that looked almost like gratitude. "You understand," she whispered as she dissolved. The cost of loving someone enough to let them transcend your love. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face as she felt the last of her familiar identity crumble away. Around them, the sanctuary began to rebuild itself, but differently now, not as a monument to perfect love, but as a living space where love could grow and change and become whatever it needed to be. Sophia, both versions, all versions, began walking toward her, and Elena opened her arms to embrace whatever came next. Sophia reached her first, not the transcendent being or the frozen child, but something beautiful and impossible that was somehow both and neither. As Elena's arms closed around her daughter, she felt the strange sensation of embracing someone who existed in multiple states simultaneously, the warm weight of a 6-year-old body, the ethereal lightness of a spirit unbound by death, and the potential energy of all the growth that had been waiting for permission to unfold. "I missed you, Mummy," Sophia whispered against Elena's shoulder, and the words carried no accusation, no demand for explanation of the 3 years Elena had kept her trapped in amber. There was only the simple truth of a connection that had survived every attempt to preserve, control, or perfect it. Elena held her daughter and wept. Not the careful, cultivated tears of grief that had sustained her for so long, but the messy, complicated tears of someone learning to love without guarantees. Around them, the sanctuary settled into its new configuration, walls solidifying into crystal that was somehow more flexible, more alive than before. The voices of the lost children resumed their harmony, but now Elena could hear the distinct melody each one carried, rather than being overwhelmed by their collective song. "What happens now?" Elena asked, the question directed as much to herself as to Sophia. "Now you get to find out who you are when you're not holding so tightly," Sophia said, and Elena marveled at the wisdom in her daughter's voice. Not the artificial precocity of a child forced into premature understanding, but the genuine insight of someone who had been allowed to grow beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. Nayeli appeared beside them, her small face radiant with relief. Elena realized that the young girl had been carrying her own burden throughout this ordeal, serving as witness to Elena's transformation, bearing the responsibility of guiding another lost parent through the labyrinth of love and letting go. Now that weight had lifted, and Nayeli looked like what she truly was, a child who had found her way home. "The wolves are calling," Nayeli said softly. "It's time to return." Elena felt a spike of panic at the thought of leaving this place, of walking away from Sophia again. But as the fear rose, she recognized it for what it was, the old pattern, the familiar trap of believing that love meant never letting go. She took a breath and felt the new space inside herself, the place where her identity as Sophia's mother had been replaced by something larger and more uncertain. "I'll come back," Elena said to Sophia, then paused. "If that's what you need, if that's what serves your growth." Sophia smiled, and Elena saw in that expression the ghost of every smile her daughter had ever given her, along with all the smiles that were yet to come in ways Elena might never comprehend. "I'll always be here, Mama, but not the way I was before. I'll be here the way rivers are here, always moving, always changing, always connected to something bigger." The crystalline chamber began to fade around them, not collapsing but gently releasing them back to the world of snow and stars and finite bodies that required warmth to survive. Elena felt the cold immediately, but it was different now, not the killing freeze that had driven her toward hypothermia during her desperate pursuit, but the clean bite of winter air that reminded her she was alive, that she had work to do in the world of the living. The massive grey wolf waited at the cave entrance, his ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been approval. As Elena approached, she felt the weight of everything that had changed, not just her relationship with Sophia, but her understanding of herself, her work, her purpose. Dr. Elena Vasquez, child psychologist, had entered this cave. The woman emerging was still Elena, still someone who worked with children, but her motivations had shifted from trying to heal others as a way of healing herself to simply showing up with whatever wisdom her own breaking and rebuilding had given her. "Thank you," she said to the wolf, though the gratitude extended far beyond his role in bringing her here. She was thanking the entire impossible sequence of events that had led her to this moment of standing in her own life without the armor of familiar pain. The wolf inclined his massive head, then turned and disappeared into the darkness beyond the cave. Elena understood that their paths would not cross again. He had served his purpose, and she had learned what she needed to learn. As she and Nayeli began the journey back to Koyuk, Elena felt the vastness of the questions that awaited her. How would she explain her absence? What would she do with the knowledge that love could transcend death, but only if it also transcended the living person's need to control that transcendence? How would she live in a world where she was no longer defined by her loss? She didn't have answers, and for the first time in years, that felt like freedom rather than failure. The lights of Koyuk appeared through the pre-dawn darkness, like scattered stars that had fallen to earth and forgotten how to rise. Elena felt each step toward the village as a small act of translation, carrying impossible knowledge back into a world that measured truth by what could be documented, filed, and explained to insurance companies. Nayeli walked beside her with the easy confidence of a child returning from an ordinary adventure. Elena marveled at this, then realized it shouldn't surprise her. For Nayeli, conversations with spirits and journeys into crystalline sanctuaries were simply part of the landscape of possibility. It was Elena who had to learn how to carry magic back into a world that had no vocabulary for it. The first person who spotted them was Thomas, Nayeli's uncle, who came running through the snow with tears streaming down his weathered face. Elena watched the reunion, the desperate embrace, the rapid-fire Inupiaq that carried 3 days of terror and relief, and felt something settle in her chest. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to be messy and human and imperfect. Thomas wasn't trying to hold Nayeli in amber or preserve her exactly as she was. He was simply grateful to have her back, ready to let her continue becoming whoever she was meant to be. "Where were you?" Thomas asked in English, his eyes moving between Nayeli and Elena with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "With the wolves," Nayeli said simply. "Dr. Elena came to bring me home." Elena felt the weight of that statement, the way it was both completely true and utterly inadequate. She had gone into the wilderness to bring Nayeli home, but in the end, it was Nayeli who had guided her through the labyrinth of her own transformation. The child had served as witness and anchor, while Elena learned to release her death grip on love itself. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the clinic, her face gaunt with exhaustion. Elena saw herself reflected in Sarah's expression, the haunted look of someone who had been forced to confront the limits of everything they thought they understood about their work, their purpose, their ability to help. "Elena," Sarah's voice cracked with relief. "We've been searching, the search and rescue teams, the state police. Where the hell were you?" Elena opened her mouth to answer and realized she had no idea what to say. "How do you explain that you followed a wolf into a cave that existed outside normal space, where you confronted the shadow of your own grief and learned to love without possessing? How do you tell your colleague that you've discovered love can transcend death, but only if it first transcends the living person's need to control it?" "I got lost," Elena said finally, and felt the truth of it resonate in ways that had nothing to do with geography. Sarah stared at her, clearly recognizing that something fundamental had changed, but lacking the framework to understand what. "You were gone for 3 days, Elena, in sub-zero temperatures. You should be dead." "I know," Elena said quietly. "I think maybe I was, for a while." Over the next several hours, Elena found herself navigating a careful dance of partial truths. Yes, she had followed Nayeli into the woods. Yes, she had found shelter in a cave. Yes, the experience had been transformative in ways she was still processing. No, she couldn't fully explain what had happened. No, she wasn't ready to submit an official report. She watched the village respond to Nayeli's return with a celebration that felt both joyous and matter-of-fact. These people lived in a landscape where the impossible regularly intruded into daily life. Children sometimes walked with wolves. Spirits spoke through blizzards. Love found ways to transcend death. They didn't need explanations, only the simple fact of a child safely returned. Elena found herself thinking about her practice in Anchorage, about the parents who came to her seeking ways to heal their children's trauma. to restore their families to some imagined state of wholeness. She realized she would return to that work, but everything about her approach would be different. Instead of trying to fix people back into predetermined shapes, she would focus on helping them discover who they were becoming in the aftermath of their breaking. That evening, as Elena packed her few belongings in the clinic's spare room, she felt Sophia's presence settle around her like a familiar embrace. Not the desperate clinging of the past 3 years, but something lighter and more alive. The ongoing connection between two people who loved each other enough to let that love grow and change. "I'm proud of you, Mama," Sophia's voice whispered through the Arctic wind rattling the windows. Elena smiled, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart, wherever you're going next." As she prepared to return to Anchorage, Elena carried with her the knowledge that she was no longer the woman who had arrived in Koyuk 5 days ago. She was no longer Elena the grieving mother, or Elena the expert on childhood trauma. She was simply Elena, someone who had learned to love without requiring that love to make sense. Someone who had discovered that the deepest healing happened when you stopped trying to control what healing should look like. The questions remained vast and unanswerable, but for the first time in years, Elena found herself excited to live inside the mystery of them. The new beginning. 6 months later, Elena sat in her redesigned office in Anchorage, watching 8-year-old Marcus build something impossible with blocks. Where her old office had been sterile and professional, designed to inspire confidence in her expertise, this space felt more like a living room where difficult conversations could unfold naturally. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and windows that actually opened to let in the sounds of the city beyond. "It's not a castle," Marcus explained, his small hands carefully balancing wooden pieces that defied architectural logic. "It's a place where the sad parts and the happy parts can live together without fighting." Elena nodded, recognizing something in his words that she couldn't have heard before Koyuk. Marcus's parents had brought him after his grandfather's death, expecting her to help him get over his grief and return to being the cheerful boy he'd been before. But Elena had learned to listen for what children were actually building rather than what adults thought they should be building. "Tell me about the sad parts," she said. Marcus pointed to a section of his structure that looked precarious, ready to topple at any moment. "They're scared the happy parts will try to make them disappear. But look," he showed her how the unstable section actually provided support for a soaring tower above it. "They need each other." Elena felt the familiar flutter of recognition, the sense that children often understood things adults spent decades learning to accept. Her work had become less about fixing and more about witnessing, less about providing answers and more about sitting with questions that had no clean resolution. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Chen, another strange case up here. 7-year-old talking to her deceased grandmother. "Families freaking out. Could use your perspective." Elena smiled, typing back, "Sometimes the strange cases are the most honest ones." "What's she telling her grandmother?" Sarah's response came quickly, that she forgives her for leaving. Elena stared at the message, remembering her own journey from anger to acceptance to something larger than both. She had returned to Koyuk twice since that February, once in spring when the ice broke up and the village celebrated the return of the sun, and again in summer when Nayeli had insisted on showing her how the cave looked when filled with wildflowers instead of crystal formations. Each visit had deepened Elena's understanding that some experiences couldn't be reduced to case studies or theoretical frameworks. Nayeli had grown taller, more confident in her role as a bridge between worlds. The wolves still came to the village occasionally, but now other adults had learned to see them as Elena had, not as threats to be feared, but as messengers carrying invitations to expand their definition of what was possible. "Dr. Elena," Marcus's voice brought her back to the present. "Do you think grown-ups are scared of sad parts because they forget how to build with them?" "What do you think?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "I think maybe they tried to throw their sad parts away, but you can't really throw away parts of yourself. So the sad parts got hidden, but they're still there, making everything else wobbly." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. This 8-year-old boy had just articulated what had taken her 3 years and a journey to the edge of death to understand. The work wasn't about eliminating difficult emotions, it was about learning how they could serve as foundation stones for whatever came next. When Marcus's session ended and his parents arrived, Elena found herself having a different conversation than she would have 6 months ago. Instead of outlining a treatment plan designed to restore Marcus to his previous emotional state, she talked about the architecture of resilience, about how children who learn to integrate their difficult experiences often developed a kind of emotional flexibility that served them throughout their lives. "You're saying we shouldn't try to help him feel better?" his mother asked, confused. "I'm saying maybe feeling better isn't the same as feeling whole," Elena replied. "Marcus is building something beautiful with all of his feelings, even the difficult ones. Our job might be to support that construction rather than trying to remove the materials we think don't belong." As the family left, Elena felt Sophia's presence in the way she had learned to recognize it, not as a desperate clinging to what was lost, but as an ongoing conversation with love itself. Sophia had become less a memory to be preserved and more a teacher who continued to evolve alongside Elena's capacity to learn from her. That evening, Elena stood at her apartment window watching the sun set over Cook Inlet. The sky painted in shades of purple and gold that reminded her of the aurora dancing over Koyuk. She thought about the woman who had arrived in that village 6 months ago, driven by professional obligation and personal demons, carrying expertise like armor against the uncertainty of a world that refused to make sense. She was still Elena. She still worked with grieving families, still sat with children navigating impossible losses. But now she brought something different to that work. The hard-won knowledge that love's true power revealed itself not in holding on, but in the courage to let go and discover what wanted to emerge in the space that letting go created. The questions remained vast and unanswerable, but Elena had learned to love the questions themselves.